Well, everyone, we are coming in for our next video. We're dealing with World War One for this month, since it is, of course, the month that World War One would have ended. So, the last video we discussed the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire and how one of basically the main power that ended up starting the First World War in the first place technically didn't survive the war. It ended up dissolving completely into different nation states. For the second video that I wanted to do related to World War One for at least for this month was to take a look on something on the Allied side and something that would definitely hit a little closer to home, and that would be the American experience in World War One. What exactly was, what role did the United States play in the events of this conflict? We've heard bits and pieces in past videos that I've done of what the United States has done during the First World War. We obviously know that we were on the winning side, but many people may not know, the basis of what the American experience was, let alone that the United States was not involved in World War One until almost the very end. We almost did not get involved at all. We were only in it for roughly a little over about a year and a half before the war ended up coming to an end. So what we're going to do is take a look at the American side of things and what the experience was of the United States during the period between 1914 and 1918 in terms of this great European war that had erupted, and eventually how it got drawn into that conflict and then its experience during that conflict. So by the early 20th century, the United States was a burgeoning power on the world stage. It was a growing power in North America. It was also a growing power in world affairs, especially after winning the Spanish American War against France in 1890, not France, Spain in 1898, and in helping put down the Boxer Rebellion in China in 1900, which was a coalition of multiple Western nations trying to put down this nativist rebellion that had happened against Western influence in China. And that's another topic we may discuss at another point. But come the dawn of the 20th century, the United States, it is no longer a regional power as it had been for the majority of the 19th century. Back then, the United States was more viewed as simply a regional power. If you were going to deal in the Americas, you were going to likely have to deal with the United States, but it wasn't seen as a global power. This had changed now that the United States had acquired overseas territories and concessions in Asia, and thus was very much on the world stage. It was rapidly becoming a massive challenger to Great Britain as the most powerful and richest nation on earth, something that Britain had largely held for itself, but the United States was rapidly gaining on it. It wasn't quite there yet, but it was showing signs that it was overcoming the British economy, which, mind you, the British before the First World War had the world's largest empire, and that was quite a shock. The United States did not have an empire by any means that was on the scale of Great Britain's, but it was able to match its economy pretty much the fact that it was gaining on it. And they also had still put quite a bit of effort into modernizing the American Navy. Now, the United States did not have the most powerful navy in the world. Obviously, that title still went to Britain, and right after it, it went to Germany, who had undergone a massive military spending campaign to try to increase their naval armament. Mostly, it was the Kaiser's pet project. He wanted something to rival Britain and possibly take away that title from them of having the most powerful navy. But the United States did not have the most powerful navy, but it had undergone a recent navy modernization that had drastically improved its naval armaments. And the United States, at the dawn of the 20th century, it has also becoming one of the world's largest economies and industrial powers on the world stage. So it is quite the burgeoning power. It has a lot of resources, a lot of manpower, it has a lot of industrial capacity. It has the capacity to change the outcome of a war for a side that might be able to get it on its side in a war. Unfortunately for both sides during the war, the United States decides that it doesn't want to get involved. Why? Because the United States has long been isolationist and long avoided entanglements with foreign powers. So when World War One officially breaks out in August of 1914, the United States initially declares that it will remain neutral in this conflict, much like Italy had done in Europe. It was not going to be involved, it was not siding with either side. It simply wanted to maintain current relations it had with nations on both sides of the war, and it would not support one militarily over the other. And this was due, as I said, to a couple of things. One notable thing is the United States had long been an isolationist country ever since its founding during the 1770s. The United States, most partly under the warnings of many of the founding fathers, including George Washington himself, had kind of stayed clear of getting entangled in foreign alliances and agreements and deals and partnerships because this was seen as a way that it would entangle us in affairs that were not our own. It would entangle us in stuff in matters that weren't really in American interest at all. It was just something that we got brought into because our ally demanded. We were allies of a certain country that had an interest in it. And I mean, you could say that, us having not feel nowadays getting more involved in the world, that definitely has led to its detriments. We've gotten involved in a lot of stuff that otherwise is none of our concern, but we've gotten involved anyway, and look how we paid for it. I mean, Vietnam, of course, would be a very big one that would be on the table if you really want to go down that route. But that is one big reason why the United States stays neutral, is it does have this habit of staying isolationist. It isn't in a lot of alliances, so thus when the war breaks out, we know when war breaks out in Europe, what gets all these countries involved is this entangling system of alliances. France and Russia are allies. Russia is allied with Serbia. Austria-Hungary and Germany are allies, and it just brings a whole hodgepodge mess in. The United States isn't in any of these alliances, so it's not obligated to get into a war. It's not obligated to get in the war to defend anybody. Now, the other reason was the United States also has quite the divided opinion at home, and this is due to the US's kind of unique status as being a big home for a lot of international immigration. And we know that the United States in the later half of the 19th century and going into the early 20th century, it is a big destination for a lot of immigrants from around the world who go to America seeking a better life. And these immigrants come from diverse areas, from diverse national and ethnic backgrounds. There's no one type of person that is coming to America. And America is seen as this welcoming place for many of them. Well, because of this unique ethnic and nationality makeup in the United States, it does lead to divided opinions at home over, what side that certain people in the public support. You have the governing elite of the United States, who primarily and typically came from someone of like British ancestry. And then you have 10% of Americans at the time were of German ancestry. And thus, they're going to feel more in line with, their German relatives in Germany. And the elite are going to feel in line with the British because they have a lot of British ancestry. You have Irish Americans who aren't although the Irish are part of the British Empire, they've long wanted independence from it, and a lot of Irish Americans were even more, anti-British than the Irish back home. And many of them were very anti-British because of, how Britain had conducted rule in Ireland for the past couple hundred years. So there's some anti-British sentiment there. And Jews in the United States tended to be very anti-Russian and anti-British at times. Mostly anti-Russian because the Russian Empire had a very big history of doing these pogroms and discrimination against Jews, every so many years. So they weren't really for these allied countries either, but then there were, people that were opposed to the Central Powers. So the US has at home a public division over, who they support. It has this long-standing isolationist stance. So war breaks out, US says, "Hold the cards. I'm not getting involved. We're staying out. You guys fight it out. You fight it out like little children, do whatever you're going to do." So that is why when the war breaks out, the US does not get involved. However, the first year of neutrality is going to increasingly test America's stance to the point that the US is going to shift from an absolutely like, I'm not involved in this, I'm not getting involved in any way, I'm not supporting anyone, I'm not biased, to within a year, going to start becoming kind of a pro-allied neutral. We're officially neutral, but we're starting to kind of pick a side here. And part of this reason would come through a lot of the stuff that Germany would do in the opening, months of the war that really did not improve relations with the United States. It definitely alienated American public opinion over some of these atrocities that were being reported that the Germans were doing. Now, I'm not going to say the Allies weren't doing stuff as well, because we know that there was stuff that was hidden. But the primary problem was when the war broke out, Britain cut Germany's transatlantic cable. Any news that was coming from Europe mostly was coming through British and Allied sensors first before it got to the United States. So they were very keen on what they were allowing to get through those sensors and be given to the United States as news. So any atrocities that might be committed by, the British against any what might specify as like a war crime or anything by the French or anything by the Russians or anything like that. They were very careful to edit that out as much as possible, but make sure that they would emphasize anything that happened on the Central Powers side of things. Now, I'm not going to say that I'm not saying that the Allies were overly committing war crimes. They did commit a few. But overall, a majority of the more harsh things I do think belong to the Central Powers. Germany, in particular, its invasion of Belgium in August of 1914 in order to get to France was quite brutal. The Germans came into Belgium because they wanted to sidestep the French defenses. They thought, oh, we'll march right to Paris. And they thought, France will never see this coming. Well, they didn't see it coming. Problem was, they expected that Belgium was just going to, stand aside and let them through. That did not happen. The Belgians put up a fighting resistance, and it absolutely irritated the German military, who then started carrying out reprisals on civilians for their anticipated resistance. So the German treatment of Belgians very quickly alienated American public opinion against the Central Powers, along with the Zeppelin bombings that Germany employed against cities in France and Great Britain, and its use of poison gas starting in April of 1915 when Germany deployed gas on the First Battle of Ypres. They deployed chlorine gas, which brought a whole new horror of warfare, that of chemicals, into the war. And that these were actions that definitely alienated American public opinion to the point that, it's starting to sway, what side we're going to actually start supporting here if we were to get involved. Now, despite the growing unease with Germany, current U.S. President at the time, Woodrow Wilson, and his Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, were both committed to keeping the U.S. neutral. They knew that there were atrocities happening, but they weren't naive. They knew that the Allies probably had some stuff that they were either exaggerating or not letting through themselves. And so they determined that, yes, we're going to stay neutral. Public opinion might go this way one week, it might go another the next week. We can't judge based off a couple of actions. And Germany wasn't the only one making the US angry. Britain had also done quite a few things that was angering the US public opinion. Most notably, Britain's naval blockade of Germany was angering the United States because the US viewed it as an infringement on its right of free trade to trade with any nation that it wanted to, since it was a neutral party, that it should be able to maintain its free trade links. And just because you're at war with Germany does not mean I'm at war with Germany. And since I'm not at war with Germany, you have no right to be interfering with my free trade because I'm not at war with any of you. And that definitely angered American officials. Now, the British officials were courteous when the Americans lodged their complaints about this, about their complaints about having their rights to free trade infringed. And British officials were often courteous. They would listen to American complaints. And Britain did eventually pick up the policy of compensating in money for any confiscated goods taken from American merchants that were taken in these seizures of ships trying to get to Germany. The British did typically try to compensate them for any goods that were confiscated. And most notably, the British avoided sinking any neutral vessels. They might stop you, but they would not sink you. They were not going to openly typically attack you. They were just trying to prevent you from, trading with their enemy, which they knew the German economy would kind of be brought to ground to a certain degree if Britain could successfully cut it off from foreign imports. And that did work to some degree. Now, in February of 1915, and this is going to become a recurring thing here in the United States' neutral problems with Germany, is Germany in February of 1915 is aiming to break the British blockade around its ports. And the way they deem that, they're too afraid to take the German high seas fleet out and engage in a big climactic battle with the British Royal Navy. They don't want to do that. They're too scared of doing that because they realize that we're still outmatched by the Royal Navy and we can't risk losing the entire naval fleet in a single battle. So what they choose to do is Germany has invested more than any other nation at this point in submarines. And they decide we can use these to try to break the will of Britain to fight because we can send our submersibles who can go underwater and thus slip past the blockade, and then they can go and hunt the waters on the British Isles and give Britain the same treatment they're giving us. Shoot any, you know, target and destroy any allied shipments or even neutral shipments that are coming in, giving munitions or supplies or food or whatever else to the British, target and sink them, and it'll force Britain to ground much like they're trying to do to us. So in February of 1915, Germany would aim to stop trade going to Britain by declaring an unrestricted submarine warfare had begun. German submarines would try to starve Britain into surrender, and all ships entering British waters were liable targets, as the British Isles were officially declared by Germany to be a war zone. This is going to have a major impact again on American attitudes toward Germany because in this proclamation that the British Isles are a war zone, the Germans are also making it more than clear that they are willing to, target neutral shipping as well. And part of this had also come about because prior to the declarement of unrestricted submarine warfare, the Germans had tried to go under the normal, there was a procedure for when submersibles would attack a vessel. They typically would surface, they had like a surface gun on their conning tower, and they would usually threaten these unarmed merchant vessels and tell them, stop to be searched. If they found anything that was meant to be going to the enemy, they would then give that vessel time to evacuate before sinking it. They would try to not kill anybody. Unfortunately, what the British started doing was arming these supposed unarmed merchant vessels, and thus, when the Germans were playing by the rules of war and stopping these merchant vessels to be searched, they were getting fired at by these supposedly unarmed merchant vessels that were in fact armed. So this started forcing the submersibles to have to abandon the normal rules of engagement. They couldn't guarantee that they weren't going to be threatening the lives of their crews if they stopped and searched this vessel. So they started coming to the conclusion if the British aren't going to play by the rules, neither are we. We're just going to start as soon as we see a ship. We're not going to do the search and seizure anymore. We're just going to torpedo. If we suspect that it's heading for where we think and it's carrying what we think, it's not even getting a warning. It will be torpedoed. So that kind of brings a worse bit of the situation to the head because now they're not stopping these merchant vessels, including neutral ones. They're just opening fire on site. On April 22nd, the German embassy in Washington, D.C. would publish a warning to prospective passengers looking to travel on the next transatlantic crossing of the famous ocean liner RMS Lusitania, reminding them in this message that was published that the British Isles remained a war zone. Now, the Lusitania, it was one of the more famous ocean liners back in the day. It belonged to the British Cunard Line Company. It had, in fact, been one. It and its sister Mauritania had set transatlantic crossing speed records early in their careers, and they were the two ships that inspired the also British White Star Line to build Titanic and her three sisters to counter them in terms of luxury, not speed. But the Lusitania in 1915, it was one of the few ocean liners still doing regular crossings across the Atlantic due to this threat of submarine warfare. And its next voyage was scheduled for May 1st, and it was on April 22nd that the Imperial German Embassy in DC did publish a warning in American newspapers that reminding anyone looking to cross on Lusitania that, hey, well, not saying that the ship's going to get sunk, but just reminding you it is going to Britain. The waters around Britain are a declared war zone. It is liable to be targeted and possibly sunk. So, just fair warning if you do so at your own risk. And we do have an image of that warning that was given about the from the Imperial German Embassy. This is a image of the warning that was posted in the newspaper on April 22nd of 1915. So it shows a little bit of the sailings of looks like Lusitania here. Yep, and these are other Cunard ships that were leaving, as we can see. Her next voyage would be on May 1st, and then she would depart again on May 29th. But what we do notice is down here, this is the warning, Imperial German Embassy. And the notice reads the following. Notice: travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies and Great Britain and her allies. That the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles. That in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or of any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. Dated the April 22nd, 1915. Sorry. So Lusitania would leave New York City for what would end up being her final voyage on May 1st of 1915 with almost 2,000 passengers aboard. As she ended up nearing the coast of Ireland on May 7th, she was ended up being tracked by a German submarine, U-20, who had spotted her and had recognized her, and she ended up getting torpedoed. U-20 fired a single torpedo at Lusitania just off the coast of Kinsale, Ireland, and she ended up going down within, I think, about 18, yes, about 18 minutes. It was very, very quick. The ship took on such an angle and sank so quickly that the crew were unable to launch many of the lifeboats due to the angle of the ship and all the other disaster that was going on so quickly. And the power went out fairly quick as well. So passengers got lost inside the ship before they could even get out onto the boat deck and actually try to flee. In the Lusitania's sinking, there were 1,198 killed, including 100 children and 128 Americans. The sinking of the Lusitania would enrage public opinion in the United States against Germany even further. Germany would claim, and this is perhaps the biggest what if question I think of the time. Germany claimed at the time that the sinking of the Lusitania had been justified because, although the Lusitania was a passenger vessel, they had information that indicated that Lusitania was hauling war supplies. It was hauling munitions. And th- they claimed that since Lusitania was carrying, munitions and war supplies for the British military, that made her a liable war target. That if Britain didn't want her sunk, they should not have put civilian passengers at risk by carrying war supplies on a civilian vessel. And Britain, of course, denied all these allegations, denied that the Lusitania was ever carrying munitions, and the Americans bought into it. They absolutely said, no, she wasn't carrying munitions. Well, here to come find out decades down the road, when we've done, more searches to Lusitania's wreck site, they have found munitions on the wreck site. They're still there to this day. Boxes of rifle cartridges and other things have been found that are definitely munitions. She was carrying a couple crates of them. And that does beg the question, Britain was lying. Germany was actually right. So did it make in some way this a justified sinking? It was a horrible sinking, but was it in any way justified by the factor that Britain had been lying and Lusitania, despite being a civilian passenger vessel, she was carrying supplies of war and thus was already in violation of the typical rules of war. So it does beg the question of what might have happened had the United States found out that Britain had lied and that Lusitania had had these munitions aboard her. It makes you wonder what could have happened with public opinion. Now, Britain's naval blockade of German not oh, that goes back a page, I'm sorry. So we have that Lusitania would end up sinking and the munitions. So President Wilson very quickly would send a series of notes to German government officials denouncing the sinking of Lusitania as both as illegal and counter to quote the rights of humanity. Now this started to worry the German government, who worried that the United States could possibly be drawn into the war over this anger over the Lusitania sinking and the sinking of further American ships through the unrestricted submarine warfare campaign. Fearful of drawing the United States into the war, Germany would formally give a pledge to President Wilson in August of 1915 after another British liner was sunk. The Arabic was sunk with another couple American casualties. And this finally convinced Germany to give President Wilson a pledge to avoid attacks on passenger ships and end unrestricted submarine warfare. This hoping that this would keep the United States from getting involved in the war because the Germans knew the United States is a burgeoning world power. It has quite a bit of resources, it has quite a bit of manpower. If it joins the side of the Allies, that could tip the balance in their favor. So they're trying to keep America neutral as much as they can. So if that means we got to suspend the unrestricted submarine warfare campaign for right now, we got to do it. So here is an image of a drawing of what Lusitania looked like as she was sinking. She went down by the head rather quickly. But this was the event that kind of definitely swayed American opinion against Germany, was now in this European war, there are Americans, neutral Americans are getting killed. And let's see. Here, in case we need a reminder, here is image of President Wilson, who was president at the time of World War One. I'm actually possibly have him as a distant cousin of some sort. From what my ancestry research has shown, I may be very distantly related to him, but I'm not entirely certain. But this was him. He was president during World War One. Let's see, other ones here. All right. So, despite American neutrality, however, the American banks would lend large sums of money to the Allies, and munitions were often sold to Britain and France in large quantities. In 1917, by April of 1917, when the U.S. would formally enter World War One, there had been about $2.3 billion in loans given to the Allied nations of Britain and France, compared to only $27 million given to Germany. So there's already a bias in America's financial institutions over who they're willing to financially back in this war. And they give out these loans knowing well that if, say, Britain and France lose the war, well, that $2.3 billion that we've loaned them, we ain't getting that back. So you're also it kind of pushes you financially to support. If the financial institutions are supporting one side, you're kind of pushed to support one side because that's a bunch of money that you're not going to get back if they end up losing the conflict. British and French agents were also able to place orders and ship goods at will, while German agents would frequently have to reroute their purchased goods through neutral countries in order to avoid the British blockade. Since Britain and France had open channels of trade with the United States still, they could still conduct an open trade. I need a shipment of, this much of whatever food supply it was, or even munitions, which the United States was willing to sell to them. And, they could just place the order for it and then ship it. Germany, on their other hand, has a British blockade to worry about, so they have to reroute any purchases that they make through neutral countries that can then get it delivered to Germany while being able to go around the blockade, which makes it a lot harder for Germans to make successful purchases without them being intercepted. Now, the US economy, due to this driving trade that starts to come about from, trading with both sides in the war, it ends up coming to a massive economic boom due to this business. Exports would rise over two times their pre-war levels in late 1915. The stock market shares also increased by roughly 80%. This was an economic boom for America. We're making money off of the war in Europe, even though we're not involved in it, not militarily. And again, like we said, if the Allies lost the war, the money that was loaned would never be repaid. And this kind of puts us more on a pro Allied footing because we're backing them more financially than the Central Powers, and we've lent them more money, we've lent them more supplies. We're kind of forcing ourselves to support them more, or else we give up on our investments. Now, concerned with the increasing support that the U.S. was starting to show for the Allies, German agents in the United States would end up mounting a campaign of sabotage. They would do multiple things to hinder any shipments of any materials to the Allies from the United States, including setting warehouses on fire, shipyards on fire, and exploding supplies. Most notably, one that definitely was a big one was the Black Tom incident that happened, I believe it was in New Jersey. Let me double check, but this was an incident of a large stockpile of munitions being blown up that was intended for shipment to the Allies. And it was done by German saboteurs who had gone out of their way to make sure that this shipment never left that dock. Yes, it was an act of arson. And this was actually in New York Harbor. It was not in New Jersey, I don't believe. Unless it was on the other side of the river. Jersey City, New Jersey. So, okay, that's why I'm thinking New Jersey. But yes, the Black Tom explosion absolutely was a devastating explosion. It blew up roughly about $20 million of goods, that about 580 million today, and even damaged the Statue of Liberty from the explosion. And this was all done by German saboteurs who were trying to deny the Allies these supplies that they were getting from the neutral United States. So they went out of their way to blow them up before they left the dock. Which, of course, when the U.S. found out that it was the act of these German saboteurs, this worsened relations with Germany even further. British intelligence, of course, kept the U.S. informed of these activities. Despite the prevailing sense of wanting to stay neutral, however, many Americans were volunteering to join the fight in Europe and different foreign legions that were set up in allied countries. One that was definitely set up, I don't know if I have this one on there. Do I have another? Yes, I do. So, for example, we had the American Field Service, which provided medical aid for Allied forces in Europe. Many Americans would also join the French Foreign Legion in order to see combat, with one of the most notable American-made units in France was that of the Lafayette Squadron, which was a French air unit squadron composed of American volunteers, which even saw action at the Battle of Verdun in 1916. Now, by late 1915, the U.S. preparedness movement, which included former President Teddy Roosevelt, was starting to argue extensively for the United States to prepare for a eventual war, for getting involved eventually, by introducing universal military service through conscription. They were opposed by groups such as socialists, women, church groups, and anti-war groups who viewed conscription and, preparing for war. Why would we prepare for war? We're not going to war. The prevailing sentiment in the United States was, we're not getting involved in Europe's affairs. Why should we, we're staying neutral, so why would we adopt conscription if we're not getting involved in war? One of the popular songs of that day for all get out was literally "I didn't raise my boy to be a soldier." That was a very big song at this time period when the preparedness movement is going out. It's just that much of the national attitude is opposed to getting involved in this war. In June of 1916, at a compromise was reached in what we call the National Defense Act. It would double the size of the U.S. Army, but no conscription. It would be a volunteer army only, like we have now, and the National Guard would also be enlarged in order to prepare the United States, allow for volunteers to increase the army size, but we're not introducing conscription. So it's a compromise for both sides. In November of 1916, President Wilson was even reelected on the promise that he, quote, kept us out of war, even though war was now only a couple months away. Wilson, yes, had kept the United States largely out of war, but unfortunately for him, he wasn't going to be able to keep that promise a second term. By early 1917, the continued stalemate in the war was starting to strain the German economy to an immense degree. The turnip winter of 1916 to 17 saw widespread famine and social unrest start to envelop Germany and the other Central Powers as they started to run out of, basically not run out, but the little game of trying to see who can last out longer is starting to go in the Allies' favor, not in the side of the Central Powers. So on February 1st, in order to try to change the game and try to get any sort of advantage that it can to try to bring Britain to an armistice, to a peace negotiation, Germany decides, knowing that it might provoke the United States, decides to resume the unrestricted submarine warfare that it had put a halt to almost 2 years earlier. They- And this would lead to another diplomatic crisis with the United States that would have a very, very big part and why we actually got involved at the end. Germany was aware that the resumed unrestricted submarine campaign might end up bringing the United States into the war, and German diplomats began preparing for that possibility extensively. In January of 1917, German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann had sent a coded telegram to the German embassy in Washington, D.C. The telegram announced Germany's intent to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, but it also directed the embassy to forward it to their ambassador in Mexico City, Mexico, to propose to the Mexican government of a potential alliance between Mexico and Germany in the event that the United States ended up joining the Allies. It promised to aid Mexico in regaining its lost territories of Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico, territories that Mexico had lost almost a century before in the Mexican American War of the 1840s. Now, the Zimmerman telegram, the stupidest part of this was that the Germans sent this over it was an encoded telegram, but they sent it over a British cable because, as we said, Britain had cut Germany's transatlantic cable very early in the war. So they encoded this. However, the Germans did not realize that the British had cracked their code that they were using to encrypt their messages. So the British intercepted this, decoded it, and then when they read what it was, guess who they forwarded it to? He's like, "Oh my goodness, we got it. This will force the United States in on our side." Guess what? It did. It did very rapidly. So Britain sends us the telegram, and the Zimmerman telegram is made public in the United States on March 1st of 1917. And when Arthur Zimmerman is later asked whether or not it was true, he did confirm that yes, I did send this. And this would drastically change public opinion in the United States against Germany. Almost any pro-German sentiment that had existed in the United States almost evaporated overnight. And almost every bit of public anger in the United States went toward Germany for suggesting to Mexico, where US Mexican relations have been pretty badly off for quite a few years now, but since at least 1910, because of the ongoing Mexican Revolution. Just the year prior, a band of Mexican revolutionaries had come across the border in New Mexico, burned a settlement, and then dashed right back across the border, which had led to a punitive US military expedition to try to catch the bandits. And thus, Mexico and US aren't on really good terms already, and now Germany is seemingly coming in here and instigating a possible war if the United States ends up declaring war on it with its next door neighbor. In March of 1917, Russia would end up devolving into revolution as the Tsar of Russia was forced to abdicate his throne, ending monarchy there, and Russia would become a provisional republic, replacing the autocratic regime of the Tsar that had long been an obstacle for President Wilson when trying to convince the public that the Allies were pro democracy, because Russia was one of the main Allied powers. And up until this point, Russia had been ruled by the Tsar. The Tsar was absolutely autocratic in his rule. Anytime that a little vestige of democracy was trying to be introduced into Russian politics, he would try to stamp it out. With the Tsar now gone and Russia now a declared provisional republic, all of the major Allied powers were now officially, in some form or another, along a line of democratic government. Wilson could now use that in his calls for joining the war effort. Germany had threatened US sovereignty by possibly insinuating a war with its next door neighbor, an alliance with its next door neighbor to come and attack it. And at this point, it had resumed the unrestricted submarine warfare. And now all the major Allied powers were pro democratic. So it was what Wilson was trying to frame it as was it's democracy against the autocratic regimes of, Germany and Austria Hungary, which would definitely allow him to make the call for democracy. On April 6th, 1917, just a little over a month after the Zimmerman telegram was made public, President Wilson formally asked Congress to declare war on Germany. He's quoting, of course, his most famous sentence from this, asking Congress to declare war on Germany. His most famous sentence delivered at that address was that the world must be made safe for democracy. And we do have an image of President Wilson giving that address and a political cartoon of the Zimmerman telegram here. So here we have the image of President Wilson addressing Congress, asking them to declare war on April 6th, 1917, which Congress would do later that day. And then here we have a political cartoon of the German Kaiser seemingly offering the Mexicans, New Mexico, Arizona, and Texas if they come in on the war on their side. So the U.S. it officially, as of early 1917, the U.S. has officially joined the war effort. However, it joined World War One very, very unprepared for a major conflict. It only had 97,000 volunteers join the army by April of 1917 from the previous year's, you know, act that allowed volunteers in. Now, Wilson began to become supportive of conscription at this point, which would better balance the needs of both the military to fight a major war in Europe and the industrial need for skilled workers in the United States itself. This would result in the Selective Service Act, which was passed on May 18th, 1917, requiring all male American citizens aged 21 to 31 to register for the draft by June 5th of that year. The age range would later be changed to those between ages 18 to 45. The draft did see certain instances of exemption for individuals. Federal and state officials were exempted from the draft, workers in designated industries, and men whose family circumstances required their presence at home. Quakers were actually the only group of people that were given exemption on grounds of conscience. It didn't matter if you were Mennonite, Amish, or Christian, unless you were a Quaker, you weren't getting exemption on grounds of conscience. which was kind of odd that that was the only one that they allowed for that. Pardon me. I had to take a drink there. And African Americans were subject to the draft as well, but they would serve in segregated units. The United States military at this time did have African American units, but they were segregated. Whites and blacks were not in the same units. And that would not change until after World War II. So, even though only a small minority of Americans opposed the draft, the government did take some severe measures to silence criticism of the government's prosecution of the war effort. The Espionage Act of June 1917 and the Sedition Act of May 1918 would present some of the strongest violations of the First Amendment that had been seen in years by the government, and they would both would later, I think at least one of them would later be overturned. I think one of them's still in effect though, but it basically made it almost illegal to even criticize the war effort, criticize the draft, criticize the government during wartime. That was absolutely egregious that that was even a thing. And among one of the people that was punished for this was popular socialist politician Eugene Debs. He ended up getting jailed and sentenced for 10 years in prison simply for anti draft speeches, which was absolutely egregious. Americans at home during the war were encouraged to help the war effort by buying Liberty bonds from the Treasury and by planting Liberty gardens to help with rationing. If you could grow your vegetables at home, that was vegetables you didn't have to run to the market and get, and that was more vegetables for to be sent to the boys in Europe for them to use. Women also began taking on roles outside the home, met roles that had traditionally belonged to men in their jobs, but since with the men away fighting, the women started to take on. They would also do this during World War II to a much greater degree. But this World War One presented one of the first times that they started doing this, which would contribute to increased calls for women's suffrage, which would eventually be granted in 1920 with the 19th Amendment. Now, the US would officially enter World War I as an associate power of the Allies, not as an allied power itself, mostly because the US still wanted to maintain some independent operation in Europe, and it wanted to avoid entanglements with European powers and operate independently, so that way, after the war, they wouldn't have to worry about our American interests diverging from French and British interests, because if we're fighting as a combined army, that might become a problem. We would begin mustering together an American Expeditionary Force, or AEF, in General John Pershing, who had led the raid into Mexico the year before. He would be the selected general to command this American Expeditionary Force, and he was a very capable commander, very capable commander. So he was actually a pretty good pick for this. The AEF was slow, however, to materialize in Europe, since the United States had only the 17th largest military in the world at the time that they entered the war. They had quite a bit of training of troops to do and recruiting and, conscripting, drafting, and then training all these troops proficiently before you sent them off to fight in Europe. By November of 1917, the US had only 130,000 troops in France. Pershing would request he wanted 3 million men in France over the proposed 1 million that were to be sent. Eventually, there were about 2 million men would eventually be sent to the battlefields in France during the First World War. Pershing and Wilson would insist, however, on keeping the AEF independent for a majority of its time in Europe. They did not, as I said, they didn't want Britain and France using American units as reinforcements, which was basically they were dying for. These were the battle-hardened veterans of the First World War. They had lost so many of their own men. Their units needed reinforcements. They were struggling with recruitment drives at home. So they see the Americans like, oh yeah, yeah, could we take some of your units and put them in ours? Like we need the reinforcements. And Pershing's like, no. He's like, they're staying under American command. They're not falling under yours. And this would end up causing some issues with some of the Allied generals, especially in the German spring offensive of 1918, when they really need these reinforcements and they can't get them really. Russia had also withdrawn from the war after the Bolshevik Revolution in November of 1917, so this also was putting a much bigger strain on the Allies in Europe because now Russia was officially out of the war and the Germans were shifting almost their entire war effort to the Western Front, hammering up casualties there, and thus that was really amping the need for reinforcements and get the Americans here the quicker the better. By May of 1918, over 650,000 U.S. troops were in France by that point. They were heavily reliant, however, on Allied ammunition, armor and artillery, air, and logistical support, stuff that they largely couldn't just bring. They hadn't brought over yet, so they had to depend on what the Allies, what mostly the British and the French, and to a degree the Italians, had available there on the Western Front. The American doughboys, as they were often called, were often cheerful, lighthearted, and dismissive of difficulties. They came to Europe, ready to go at it. They thought, we'll whip the Germans in about 2 months. Well, like you're lucky you have us here. We're going to be able to help you. And to a degree, they weren't wrong because at this point, like the British and French are getting exhausted by 4 years of war, so are the Germans. They've been fighting the same war for 4 years. Their troops are getting battle hardened, but they're also getting exhausted. They've had a numerous level of casualties, and Germany's having a hard time replacing its losses as well. The problem is for it doesn't have any new country coming to its side that has a large population to aid it. The Allies, though they're exhausted, now have 2 million troops coming in from the United States to come back them up. These doughboys that have not seen combat and they're not exhausted. They're fully fed, they're fully trained, fully ready to go at it, like full on equipment and everything. Whereas Germans at this point, they're struggling with rations, they're struggling with recruitment drives. They got troops starting to desert. They're struggling with getting rifles and even clothes to the army and military at these points. It's not the best situation for them. American troops would first see battle during the German Spring Offensive of 1918, and two of the major ones that they would see during this time was on May 28th at the Battle of Cantigny, which was against veteran German units, which the Americans won that one. The Americans would also win the more famous one that followed from June 1st to the 28th of 1918, the Battle of Belleau Wood, which was against a superior number of Germans. The Germans outnumbered the Americans, but the Americans somehow managed to pull off a victory there as well. And this was done, both of these battles were actually won under Allied command after a slight relent by Pershing, who had been successfully convinced that, the Germans are onslaughting us in this offensive. We need to push them back. We need to be able to put these guys under our command right now, at least for the time being, until we've managed to defeat this offensive, or else we may not hold the front line. And Pershing, realizing the circumstances, relented for a time. He's like, fine, but in this case only. In July of 1918, the Americans would once more be independent and they would be formed into what became the American First Army, which would be the main American army going into the Western Front. The American troops would assist in several of the final Allied offensives of the war, most notably ones such as the Second Battle of the Marne in July of 1918, which was a dual offensive done with the French against the Germans on the River Aisne. You had the so-called 100 Days Offensive that would lead to the final armistice with Germany in November, but it started, I believe, August 8th when the British attacked Amiens and drove the Germans away. That would last from August to November of 1918. And then we had perhaps what is the most memorable American battle from the First World War, and that was the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive was the bloodiest campaign in American military history. It was to this day, it still holds that record. In roughly, just to give you a little bit of an image here, by the end of the war, the United States had lost, in terms of killed, it had 115,000 dead. 26,000 of those 115,000 came from the Meuse-Argonne offensive alone. It is to this day the bloodiest campaign in American military history. It remains that way. The official tally number was 26,277 Americans ended up dying in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. It was America's absolute bloodbath in the First World War. And to me, it is somewhat personal because I have one relative in my family who ended up serving in the First World War. He would have been my great grandfather, and he lied about his age, get conscripted. He ended up saying that he was 18. He was not 18. He was 16. By the time he got sent to France, he was 17, and he got sent to the Meuse-Argonne sector. I do not know what particular engagements he may have been in. I don't know where in the Meuse-Argonne that he was, but I do know that he got sent to the Meuse-Argonne sector during that campaign. He did survive. As far as I know, he didn't get wounded, but he did come home in June of 1919 is when he got discharged, but he was sent as a 17-year-old lying to be an 18-year-old to the Meuse Argonne and was sent there to fight. So to me, it has a little bit of familial history as well. By the end of the war, the United States suffered over 300,000 casualties from its exploits in the war. But mind you, that's a lot. But we got off very, very little compared to what the other allies got who had been in this for 4 years. Britain came away with, I think, about 5 or 6 million casualties by the time the war ended, and Russia was probably closer to about 7 million. So that brings us to the peace that would eventually come about, as we know. In January of 1918, President Wilson produced his famous 14 points, which was his peace plan and requirements for peace that would have to come about. Among the things that he outlined in his proposed peace terms were freedom of the seas, free trade, disarmament, self determination for nationalities, a ban on secret treaties, and the creation of an international peacekeeping assembly of nations, what would become the League of Nations, which would kind of not live up to its full expectation. But then the idea of that would carry over after World War II was done and become what we now have the United Nations, which, give or take, has only been successful to certain degrees. The war would officially end, as we all know, with the signing of the armistice with Germany on November 11th of 1918. The final U.S. casualty totals were 325,000 casualties, with the mentioned 115,000 deaths. Now, despite Wilson's part in the peace negotiations that followed and in the Treaty of Versailles, the United States would largely return to an isolationist stance following the end of the First World War. We had gone into it being an isolationist, we got drawn into it through events that were kind of, impacting us. And then when it was all done, instead of having a part in the peace that could have secured that peace for a while, we said, nope, we're going right back in the isolationist stance. Why? I don't know. We should never have done it because what it did was allow totalitarian, authoritarian regimes to come to power, such as the Nazis, such as the fascists in Italy. It allowed these regimes to come to power in Europe, and Britain and France and the other peacekeeping organizations that we had set up were largely powerless without our presence since we were not partaking in them, even though we had proposed them. And it left them powerless to do anything to stop them, which led to an even greater war 20 years down the road. Most notably, the United States didn't ratify the Treaty of Versailles. We had to sign a separate treaty with Germany, despite Wilson having to help negotiate the Treaty of Versailles. We also did not join the League of Nations, despite it coming as from one of Wilson's own 14 points from his 14-point peace plan. It was one of the points that was directly incorporated, and we weren't even part of it. So again, American military experience during World War One, we got in it very briefly. We were only in it for about a year and a half, but the impacts that we had in the peace, we tried to help there, but then but then we decided we were going to pull right back into isolationism, which obviously didn't do anything to teach us anything because 20 years later we got pulled into the next conflict that was even more deadly. So here we have a couple images I have not shown, but let's go through them now. I think it'd be a better time. So here we have an image advertising for Americans to buy war bonds during the war. This one is one that is using the Boy Scouts as the main advertisement as a way for Boy Scouts to help kind of support the war effort and their families. And let's see here. Here we have a picture of General John Pershing, who led the American Expeditionary Force into France. He was the general that had also led the expedition into Mexico to try to capture the Pancho Villa bandits that had crossed into New Mexico the year before. He was a very able commander. He actually lived to see both world wars. He died, I think, right after the end of the second one, and was kind of a tutor to many of the generals of the Second World War. See, here we have an image of some African American soldiers being offloaded in France to work, and that this was the sad thing. A lot of African American units, there were some that seen combat, but a lot of them were held back for more menial tasks like menial manual labor. And this is an image of one group that obviously was. but they should not have gotten that treatment. They were Americans just as much as any other, defending their country, fighting for their country. They should have been allowed to, come and help out as well in the combat operations. And there were some that did, such as I believe the Harlem Hellfighters was one of them that got to do actual combat operations of making quite decorated. And here we have a couple images here of some American troops in action. So this one is, I believe, I don't know what offensive this one was in, but this one was in France of some American soldiers moving up from a trench line, which you can just tell the awful uh, effect of the artillery on the surrounding landscape. All the trees have been absolutely just shredded. The ground is nothing but mud. You can tell this is nothing but, where artillery has hit multiple times. Then here we have a picture of some Americans on the Italian front. We did have a couple stationed there, as we did also declare war on the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this is them actually chucking grenades at some Austrian troops across the far. And then here we have an image of some American soldiers celebrating the news of the armistice of November 11th of 1918, that the war was finally at an end. So that, I think, concludes for this video. So if anyone has any questions, any added information, anything or anything of that manner, feel free to put it in the comment section below, and I'll be more than happy to go through it when I get the chance. I do not know what our next video is going to be quite yet. I don't know if we're going to have it next week, just because it is the Thanksgiving holiday, and I don't know if I'm going to have the time. So we'll see how that goes. If not, we'll definitely have it up by the first week of December, but which is, my goodness, it's already less than 2 weeks away. So we're rapidly coming to the end of the year. So hopefully everyone has a good rest of their week, and we'll see you all back here for the next video when that comes out. If not, hopefully everyone has a good Thanksgiving.